There is one question that quietly haunts almost everyone who has ever loved a narcissist. And if you are here right now, chances are you have asked it yourself, sometimes in the shower, sometimes at 2 a.m., sometimes in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday when nothing else is wrong. The question is simple, but it carries the weight of everything you went through. Do they ever feel anything at all after hurting you? The real answer is far more disturbing and far more liberating than what most people are told. And once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Because the truth is, narcissists do feel something after hurting you. They feel a great deal, in fact, but almost none of what they feel looks like what you have been hoping for. And once you understand the difference between what they actually experience and what you have been waiting for them to experience, something inside you finally begins to loosen. Something inside you finally begins to heal. If you are someone trying to recognize manipulation, untangle emotional wounds, and reclaim the confidence that was slowly chipped away from you, take a moment right now to subscribe, because this channel exists for exactly that reason, to help you see clearly, heal deeply, and rebuild a version of yourself that no one can ever shrink again. And if you stick with me to the end of this video, I promise you will leave with a kind of clarity that does not fade by morning. Now let us begin where most survivors begin, with the obsession. If you have spent hours, weeks, or even years wondering whether the person who hurt you ever felt guilt, shame, regret, sadness, fear, or even a flicker of remorse, you are not strange and you are not weak. You are someone whose nervous system is still searching for an ending that makes sense. The human mind is wired to seek coherence, which is why you still check their profile, why their name still makes your chest tighten, why a song on the radio can pull you back into a memory you thought you had buried. When someone hurts us deeply, especially someone we trusted with our softest parts, our brain naturally tries to make the story complete. We want to know the pain meant something. We want to know they understood what they did. We want to know somewhere in a quiet moment they sat with the weight of it and felt what we felt. Because if they did, then our suffering was witnessed. And if it was witnessed, then maybe it was not in vain. This is not weakness. This is the mind trying to repair a rupture that another person refused to repair with you, and you do not have to feel strange for carrying it, because every thoughtful person who has been deeply hurt carries some version of this. But here is the first uncomfortable truth that begins to set you free, and I want you to hear it slowly. The emotional experience of someone with strong narcissistic traits is not absent. It is simply organized differently. Where you feel guilt, they often feel exposure. Where you feel remorse, they often feel humiliation. Where you feel sadness over hurting someone, they often feel irritation that the situation is no longer under their control. This is not a moral judgment, and it is not forgiveness either. It is a psychological pattern that has been observed for decades in clinical writing on narcissistic personality structures. Their inner world is not empty, it is defended. And the defenses are so thick, so automatic, so deeply rooted in early experiences of shame and inadequacy that genuine accountability rarely makes it past the gate. When you imagine them feeling regret, what you are really picturing is your own emotional landscape projected onto theirs. You are imagining what you would feel if you had treated someone the way they treated you. And because you are an empathic person, what you would feel would be unbearable. You would not sleep. You would reach out. You would apologize more times than necessary. You would try to repair. You would carry the weight of it for years. And so you assume, naturally and humanly, that they must be carrying something similar. But they are not carrying your weight at all. They are carrying their own. And their weight is shaped by something entirely different. An invisible need to protect a self-image that cannot tolerate being seen as flawed, cruel, or wrong, even for a single, honest second. This is where the difference between genuine remorse and narcissistic injury becomes essential. So stay with me here, because this part is the key that unlocks almost everything that follows. Genuine remorse is other-focused. It is the painful awareness of having caused harm to another human being, and it produces a real desire to repair, to make amends, to sit with the discomfort of understanding the impact of your own actions. Narcissistic injury, on the other hand, is self-focused. It is the painful awareness of having been exposed, criticized, or seen as less than perfect, and it produces a desire to defend, deflect, retaliate, or quietly rewrite the story so the version of them they live inside stays intact. From the outside, both can look like emotional reactions to wrongdoing, but internally, they are worlds apart. One leads to growth, the other leads to image management. So, when a narcissistic individual seems upset after hurting you, pause for a moment and ask yourself what the upset is actually about. Are they upset because they understand your pain? Or are they upset because they have lost access to you, lost control of the narrative, lost their steady supply of admiration, or lost the polished version of themselves they were performing in front of you? These are not the same thing, and learning to tell the difference is one of the most important skills you will ever build, not just for this relationship, but for every future relationship you choose to enter. If this is starting to land for you, tap subscribe and stay close, because the layers coming next are the ones that quietly change everything, and I do not want you to miss them. There is also the experience of self-pity, which many survivors mistake for remorse, and you have probably seen it more times than you want to count. Self-pity sounds like regret on the surface. It uses similar words. It can even produce real tears, real shaking voices, real looks in the eyes. But self-pity is not about you. It is about them. It is the quiet lament of someone who feels victimized by the consequences of their own behavior. They may say they feel terrible, but listen carefully, and you will notice that the terrible feeling is about what they have lost, not what you have suffered. It is about how they are perceived. It is about their loneliness tonight. It is about the version of the story they wish was true. Their pain is real to them, but it is not your pain, and it will never become your pain no matter how hard you wish it would. Self-pity is one of the most convincing imitations of remorse that exists, and it is one of the primary tools that pulls survivors back into cycles they swore out loud they had finally escaped. Then there is wounded pride, which is perhaps the most common emotional aftermath in narcissistic individuals after any conflict or rupture. Wounded pride feels in their internal experience exactly like a wound inflicted by you. They are not the one who caused harm. They are the one who was misunderstood, mistreated, abandoned, or unfairly judged by someone who simply could not appreciate what they were offering. This is not always conscious manipulation, and that is the part that makes it tricky. For many, it is a deeply automatic restructuring of reality, a survival software running in the background, designed to protect a fragile core they never showed you. The pride is wounded because the image they worked so hard to maintain has cracked, and someone, namely you, has seen behind it. The reaction that follows is rarely apology. It is more often anger, contempt, withdrawal, silence, or a slow, careful smear campaign that rewrites the story so that they remain the protagonist and you quietly become the antagonist in a version of events that never actually happened. And these patterns repeat again and again because they work. And they work because the emotional engine beneath them is not guilt at all. It is protection. And then there is the fear. And yes, narcissists do feel fear deeply and often, and it is one of the most important emotions to understand if you want to truly grasp what is happening inside them and stop taking their behavior personally. They fear exposure. They fear being seen as ordinary, as flawed, as human in the ways that do not flatter them. They fear losing control of how others perceive them. They fear the loss of supply, meaning the steady stream of attention, admiration, validation, or emotional reactivity from the people around them. They fear, in some deep and rarely acknowledged place, that if the mask ever fully fell, there might be nothing underneath that anyone would want to stay for. This fear is not the same as caring about you, but it can look like caring, especially when it motivates them to return, to apologize in vague and poetic terms, to love bomb you with messages that feel like a movie, to promise change in ways that sound almost holy. What you are witnessing in those moments is often not the return of love, it is the return of fear, the fear of losing the mirror in which they preferred to see themselves. This is why the apologies, when they finally come, so often feel hollow, like an echo in an empty hallway. You may have noticed that even in their most seemingly remorseful moments, something was missing. There was no real acknowledgement of what they did. There was no curiosity about how you actually felt. There was no respectful question about what you needed in order to heal. Instead, there were sweeping statements, vague regrets, quick pivots back to their own pain, or subtle, careful suggestions that you had your part in it too. This is not because you were too demanding. This is because true accountability requires a level of self-confrontation that their psychological structure is built to avoid. To truly apologize, they would have to see themselves clearly for one honest moment. And seeing themselves clearly is the very thing their defenses exist to prevent from ever happening. It is also important to recognize, because this part saves people from a lot of unnecessary suffering, that not every person with narcissistic traits experiences these emotions in the same way or to the same degree. Narcissism exists on a spectrum, and human beings are complicated, layered, full of contradictions that do not always behave the way we wish they would. Some individuals have moments of genuine insight, especially under the right therapeutic conditions, often after real loss, real consequence, or real aging. Though those moments are rarer and more fragile than survivors often hope, others remain locked in patterns of denial and projection for their entire lives, moving from one person to the next like a quiet rotation. The point is not to diagnose the person who hurt you with any certainty, and the point is not to predict what they will become. The point is to free yourself from the exhausting, endless task of waiting for an internal transformation that you cannot cause and cannot control, no matter how intelligently you explain, no matter how softly you speak, no matter how perfectly you present the evidence of what they did. And this is where the focus must begin to shift away from them and finally back onto you. Because if you spend the rest of your life trying to decode their inner world, you will lose the rest of your own. The more energy you pour into understanding them, the less you have left to understand yourself, and you have already lost too much of yourself to anyone like this. The truth that survivors eventually arrive at, often after years of patient searching, is that the most important person to understand in this story is not the one who hurt you. It is you. If this is resonating, if something inside you is finally exhaling after carrying these questions alone for so long, take a second to subscribe, because every video on this channel is built to give you exactly this kind of clarity, the practical, psychological knowledge, the emotional grounding, and the healthier ways to move through the aftermath of relationships that asked too much of you and gave back far too little. Now, let us go deeper, because there is a layer beneath all of this that almost no one talks about openly. And it is the layer that, once you see it, makes the rest of the puzzle make sense in a way that almost feels like relief. The reason you obsess over whether they feel anything is not really about them. It is about you. It is about a younger part of you that learned somewhere along the way, probably very early, in a room you might not even consciously remember, that your pain only mattered if someone else acknowledged it. Maybe it was a parent who dismissed your tears because they were inconvenient. Maybe it was a family system that valued image over honesty and praised the children who smiled first. Maybe it was a culture, a religion, a school, a friendship group that quietly taught you to be quiet, accommodating, and forgiving even when you were being harmed in plain sight. Somewhere along the way, you learned that your suffering needed external validation to be real, that your wound had to be confirmed by someone else before you were allowed to call it a wound at all. And so, when someone hurts you and refuses to acknowledge it, an old wound reopens under the new one. The longing for their recognition becomes tangled with much older longings for the recognition that you never received from the people who were supposed to give it freely. This is why the obsession feels so heavy, so physical, so hard to put down. It is not just about this relationship. It is about every moment in your life when your pain was minimized, ignored, or rewritten by someone who could not or would not see you. And the most radical, most quietly healing act you can perform, starting today in this ordinary moment, is this. You can begin to validate your own pain without needing them to validate it for you. You can become the witness you were always waiting for. You can sit with the younger version of yourself and say clearly, gently, that what happened to you was real, that what you felt was real, and that you do not need their confession to make any of it true. When you begin doing this, something remarkable starts to happen, slowly, then all at once. The trauma bond begins to loosen, and you can feel the difference in your body before you can name it in your mind. Trauma bonds are maintained by unresolved emotional cycles. They are maintained by intermittent reinforcement, the push and the pull that kept you guessing for so long. They are maintained by the nervous system's attempt to predict and control an unpredictable person, because at least a familiar pattern feels safer than an unknown one. The bond persists because some part of you is still waiting for the moment when they will finally understand, finally apologize with their whole chest, finally become the person they pretended to be in the beginning. And as long as you are waiting, you are tethered. The bond does not break when they change, because they may never change in any way you can see. The bond breaks when you stop waiting, and you stop waiting not because you have given up on them, but because you have finally given up on the version of them that only existed in your hope. This is also when boundaries become possible in a real way, not as walls built out of anger, not as ultimatums built out of hurt, but as quiet acts of self-respect built out of clarity. A boundary is not a punishment. A boundary is a recognition of reality. When you set a boundary with someone who has repeatedly shown you who they are with their actions and not just their words, you are not being cruel. You are simply no longer pretending. You are no longer organizing your life around the hope that they will become someone they have not chosen to become. And you are no longer rewarding behavior that has already cost you years. You are accepting what is. And from that acceptance, you are choosing what you will allow into your life going forward with intention, with care, and with a kind of calm that you deserve. And in this acceptance, you begin to reclaim something you may not have even realized you had lost. You reclaim your own perception. One of the most damaging effects of being in a long relationship with a narcissistic individual is the slow, quiet erosion of trust in your own reality. You were told you were too sensitive, too emotional, too much, too little, too suspicious, too forgetful, too needy, too independent, too soft, too hard, and over time the contradictions piled up until you began to question what you saw, what you felt, what you knew, what you remembered, what was true. Healing involves slowly, patiently, almost tenderly rebuilding the bridge between you and your own perception. It involves trusting that what you felt was accurate. It involves believing yourself again, even when their version of events still echoes in your head. It involves learning to say, in a steady voice, "I know what I experienced, and I no longer require their permission to call it what it was." This is one of the quietest and most powerful aspects of recovery, and it cannot happen as long as you are still measuring your reality against theirs, which is why the work of walking away matters more than the moment of closure you might be waiting for. You also begin to release the fantasy of closure, and this part alone can lift a weight you have been carrying for years without realizing how heavy it was. Closure, in the way most people imagine it, is a conversation in which the other person finally understands, finally apologizes with real specifics, finally gives you the missing piece that allows everything to make sense and lets you move on with a clean heart. But closure of that kind almost never comes from someone with deeply entrenched narcissistic patterns, and you do not have to pretend it is coming soon. The longer you wait for that fantasy conversation, the longer you remain emotionally suspended in a relationship that has already ended in every way that matters. Real closure is not something they give to you. Real closure is something you build inside yourself, slowly, deliberately, through understanding, through grief, through reclaiming your time and your attention and your energy, piece by piece, week by week. Real closure is the moment you realize you no longer need the conversation you once thought you could not live without, and that moment is closer than you think, often closer than the next sunrise. There will be moments, of course, many of them, when you slip backward. Moments when an old memory rises up out of nowhere, and you find yourself wondering again whether they ever think about you, whether they ever feel any of what they put you through, whether they are happier now, whether they ever loved you at all. These moments are not failures. They are simply the nervous system processing what happened in waves, the way the body processes any significant loss, including the loss of a version of yourself that existed only in that relationship. Be gentle with yourself in these moments, because gentleness is what you needed then and what you need now. Remind yourself that wondering is not the same as going back. Remind yourself that you can hold the question without letting it pull you back into the orbit of someone who could not love you the way you deserve to be loved. Remind yourself that curiosity is not an obligation and that your healing does not require their participation. And as the months pass, you will notice something subtle but profound beginning to happen in the background of your life. You will notice that you think about them less, and then one day, less frequently still. You will notice that your sense of self begins to fill the space they used to occupy, like sunlight returning to a room that had been kept dark. You will notice that your laughter returns, that your interests return, that your sense of curiosity about your own life returns, fresh and almost childlike in the best way. You will notice that your nervous system begins to settle, that you are no longer scanning for danger in every conversation, that you are no longer bracing for the next emotional whiplash, that you can rest without listening for footsteps. This is what healing actually looks like. Not a single dramatic moment with a score behind it, but a slow, steady, ordinary return to yourself, the kind that almost no one applauds and that changes everything. If this message is reaching you at the right moment, please take a second to subscribe, to like this video, and to share it with someone who may be quietly carrying this same weight today, because the people who need this message often do not know how to ask for it, and your small act of sharing may be the first sign of clarity that finds its way into their lives when they need it most. So here is what you can carry with you from this moment forward, quietly in your pocket, until you no longer need to read it because you have become it. The person who hurt you may feel many things, but most of what they feel will never be what you were waiting for. And that is not a failure of your love. It is a reflection of their architecture, and you are never going to renovate it on your own. Their silence is not a verdict on your worth. Their refusal to acknowledge what they did is not evidence that it did not happen. Their inability to see you is not a measure of how visible you actually are. You are not invisible. You are not too much. You are not too little. You are not the problem they carefully tried to convince you that you were. You are a person who loved deeply, who tried sincerely, who endured patiently, and who is now finally choosing yourself with the same tenderness you once offered them so freely. And the moment you stop waiting for an admission that may never come is the moment your healing truly begins to move on its own, without needing their permission or their presence to keep going. Because freedom was never theirs to give you in the first place. Freedom was always quietly and powerfully yours to claim, and the claiming starts now, in this ordinary moment, with you.